at Shaker High School, and we're going to be talking with Francis Liberty, retired Lieutenant Colonel, United States Army. And Lib, we're very glad to have you today. My name is Jake Landy, by the way.
How do you do?
You know that already. And we're going to ask you some questions about your experience with the military and how it affected your life. But first of all, tell us about how you got into the Army. What caused you to get into the Army, and did you have any problems doing that?
World War II.
Okay.
They didn't have enough nurses. I graduated from nursing school from Champlain Valley in Plattsburgh, which no longer exists. I took my state boards, passed them, and they allowed us to take state boards early in those years because they were desperate for nurses in the military or any place.
Okay, do you remember the year that you graduated?
41.
41. Okay, this is before the war had started.
No, I graduated after the war had started.
Oh, you graduated after the war. Okay.
So they let us take state boards early. I took state boards when I was only 20. I came home after finishing my time at nursing school, and I said to my father, I'm going to join the Army, and he said, no, you're not. And I went down and joined. And I went back and told him, and he said to me, you've made your bed, you're going to have to lie in it now. Which is, you know.
Yeah.
So went to Fort Dix. They gave us basic training. They weren't really prepared to handle women. So we had basic training. We pitched tents, we hiked, we climbed walls, we crawled around in mud. We had people shooting at us, you know, under the barbed wire and all that stuff. That's when I learned to keep my fanny down. And a sergeant finally gave me a bag of rocks to carry around in my left hand, so I'd know enough to step out on my left. I got him later. And it was very invigorating, very rewarding. But it was also very exciting for me. Remember, I came from Catholic hospital and Catholic schools. So this was a big world to me, taking a shower with everybody else, you know, and all that stuff. That was different. But then I went to, we worked on the wards at Fort Dix for a while to get the basics of what military nurses did. Then I went to Camp Patrick Henry in Virginia. And from there we went aboard ship.
Now, what rank?
Second lieutenant.
Oh, you were second lieutenant right off the bat.
Right off the bat.
Interesting.
Yeah, and then we went. But that was only complimentary rank. They didn't make us official officers, I think, until 51 or 57, I think. We were paid.
You were paid as?
It was complimentary. We weren't officers.
You wore the rank?
We wore the rank. But they made it official.
Interesting.
In 57.
Something I read about, there were like very ugly rumors about women going into the Army or into the nurse corps at the beginning of World War I. Is that true?
Yes.
Who would be saying things like this, and why? Any idea? Remember?
What do you mean ugly things?
No, it just didn't seem to be right for women to be going into.
Oh, it wasn't. Nurses were classified as lower than low in those days, right along with the evening ladies.
But then what happened after?
They began to appreciate them and realize that they were educated women, able to do certain tasks and do them well. So, and we were treated with all the respect in the world.
Interesting.
I mean, everybody was very respectful of us.
A parallel, and I don't know if you would be familiar with this, that initially in training, medics were low life. That, hey, these guys don't want to have rifles, but when the units got into combat, things changed. Is
Oh,
there
yes,
a
it did.
parallel there between
Yes,
nurses
yes.
in the beginning and
Then they started to appreciate them. A lot of conscientious objectors became ambulance drivers and medics. And they proved to be much braver than the guy that was carrying the rifle. You know, they were going right in there and doing basic first aid to get them out and loading them into ambulance or later on into choppers. And they were all educated men. Some of them were psychologists and psychiatrists and all that stuff. They were conscientious objectors.
did you work with them a lot?
Yes.
In the World War
Yes,
II?
yes. They were good.
Interesting.
And once you taught them something to do, they never forgot it. You know, you didn't have to go back and tell them again.
So you had basic training at
Fort Dix.
then down to Virginia.
Yeah.
And after Virginia?
We went aboard ships.
Okay.
And, you know, you walk up the gangplank and you have a duffel bag in your left hand. You have a helmet on,
Yeah.
which is God's worst invention. And you have 60 pounds of medical supplies on your back. Now, I was a young, slim kid in those days, but you got up to the head of the gangplank and you gave your last name, your first name, your middle initial, and your serial number. So I walked up there and I said, Liberty, Francis M, N799517. The guy looked at me and said, oh my God, you're a woman. I said, last time I checked. He said, I got you billeted with the men. They had spelled my first name wrong. Spelled it with an I. So he said to me, stand over there. Now, our chief nurse was a very tall, stately woman. I think at one time she was the director of nurses someplace. She said to me, and don't move. Where was I going to go? So pretty soon along come another nurse, and her name was Marion. They had her billeted with the men too. Marion is a male name in the South. So they slung hammocks between, they had 4 bunks in each room, and they slung a hammock between the bunks in 2 staterooms. 4 of those people in that stateroom were seasick, and I wasn't one of them. So I went out, and the first night sat in the hall, you know. And the second night I saw people going up and down these stairs, you know, and I thought, I wonder if it's nicer out there. So I went up there, and this girl who was down the hall from me followed me, and we crawled in behind a gun emplacement and curled all up together. Cold, it was in October on the Atlantic. 2 seamen came along. They said, you can stay here, but you can't make a sound. And for God's sakes, don't light a match.
Now, this was a Navy ship?
No, this was a
cargo,
what did they call
freighter?
them? Liberty ships.
Liberty ships, named after you.
Yeah. So the next night when we went up there were 2 pillows and blankets. So that was the best way to spend it. I couldn't, if I had stayed down there with those others, I was going to be sick. But I was never sick, and neither was she.
Interesting. So you went from, was that New York?
Virginia.
Virginia to England?
We went to England, and there I was taken out of the group because I had OR experience and sent to this other group that was going over. There was a Texas group. And that's where I learned that damn Yankee was all one word. Because I was the only Yank in the crowd. And we went to Africa. And we were in Africa about maybe a month. And then one night they got us all up and put us on these little boats, the LSTs, and we went over to Anzio.
So you were, what phase of the Anzio landing were you
We were supposed to be the third. We were the
Third
first.
wave, and you were in the first wave.
Still the first, because their information about resistance was wrong. And it was a Texas division that we went into, the 86th. So we get there, and this big colonel, God, he looked like a giant, says to our chief nurse, "My God, you're women, you're not supposed to be here yet." She said she was all of 5 feet tall. And she had a long red braid that she wore down her back. And she looked up at him, put her hands on her hips, and said, "So, we're here, deal with it." So we lived in foxholes. And that's when I learned why the Army told me to keep my butt down. Because we had to crawl to the other foxholes and drag the kids back that were injured. And they made us a rather large foxhole, and that was the first aid station. And you know what? Nobody was afraid. We were too young. We were all young, 20, 21, 22. We were not afraid. We were stupid. Mm-hmm. But we lost 7 nurses.
You did. Mm-hmm. That had to be tough.
That was hard when you had to drag them back.
After Anzio?
We went up to Rome. And along the way, we stopped at certain camps and stuff and refilled their medical supplies.
Yeah.
Being women, we always had to go to the bathroom.
Yes. True.
So we got to one place, and all it was a slit trench. Now we're in slacks. So we went out to the chief nurse and we said, "We can't use that, it's a slit trench." So she walked up to this commanding officer and she said, "The girls can't use that, it's a slit trench. Do you have any other thing?" He said, "Tell them to deal with it." I don't know if you want me to say this or not.
Go ahead.
She says to him, "My ladies are setters, not pointers. Fix it." She got it fixed. But she was like that.
Yeah.
And then we were stationed in Rome. And we had one of Mussolini's summer palaces as a hospital.
As a hospital.
Yeah, and we used one of his bathtubs as a Hubbard tank for the orthopedic injuries. The fellows would go in there and exercise their muscles and their legs and swim around. And it was a very nice hospital. It was a very good duty. And we could walk to Mass every day at St. Peter's.
Really?
And one of the most beautiful sights you'd ever want to see in your life is those 12 pillars that represent the apostles in the moonlight with the fountain going. It's a beautiful, and I was there when the Pope first came out.
You did see the Pope?
Oh yeah. When he first came out after the end of the war, everybody from the hospital that could get out went, especially they let all the Catholics go. And this one dentist that I was friends with, he and I went together and we're kneeling in the mud and crying, and the Italians are hollering, "Viva la Papa!" So this doctor looks at me and he said, "I don't know why the hell I'm crying, I'm Jewish." But it was a magnificent sight.
Wow, that had to be a special experience for you.
Yeah, and then I came home.
This is after the end of the war?
At the end of the war. And I got out of the Army.
You did?
Yeah.
This is 45?
Yep, and I thought I was discharged. I wasn't.
You were released from active duty?
I was separated.
Separated.
If you got out on a Monday or Wednesday or Friday, you were separated. If you got out on a Tuesday, Thursday, or Saturday, you were discharged. Now you figure that one out. But the Army and its infinite wisdom. So I came home, I started to go to St. Rose's to school, and I was working. I didn't have a bit of trouble getting a job, not a bit of trouble. I was a night supervisor. I was younger than all the other people working for me.
And this is?
At the Leonard Hospital in Troy.
In Troy.
So then Korea came along.
51.
In 51, 52. I got called back in. I couldn't believe it. I said to my father, I'm discharged. He said, apparently not.
They knew how to get to you.
Yeah, so I had to go to Governor's Island for a physical.
Now, Korea, what rank were you when you?
Captain.
You were captain?
They promoted me to captain.
Interesting, okay, wow.
So I was a first lieutenant before I got out.
Okay.
So my father was in the hospital with a very bad heart. So I tried to stay home, you know, but they wouldn't let me. They said he had other daughters in the area. So I said, all right. So I went in to see him. And I said to him, Pop, I'm going to have to go. He said, my girl, you have a talent that your country needs right now. I'm very proud of you. And he was not a flag waver.
That's very different from what you said earlier. He didn't want you to go in the beginning.
So I went into, I was at Fort Dix for a couple of months. And I went down to Fort Campbell, Kentucky.
Oh, yeah.
I was working on the orthopedic ward, and they were sending patients, flying patients in almost immediately after they'd been injured from Korea. So the colonel comes along this one day and he says to me, Liv, we're getting a whole bunch of amputees in. We got to set up for them. I said to him, we don't even have basins to soak stumps. What are we going to do? He said, well, we got to find them someplace. So this sergeant was standing there and I said, Sarge, we need a bunch of basins to soak stumps. He said, oh, those are the high round ones? And I said, yes. He said, take care of it. Don't worry about it. So the next day I come in and there's this whole bunch of basins on the shelves, you know, in the supply room. I said to him, how did you do that? They were all sterilized. He said, you don't want to know. So I didn't think anything more about it. So a couple of weeks later, I'm down in the mess hall. And one of the nurses that worked OB-GYN came in and she's sitting there and she said, you know, the strangest thing has happened. And I said, what? She said, all of our placenta basins are gone. I said, really? That's terrible. So I went back up and I said to him, now I know. He said, you don't know what we went through getting. See, all of the material or the equipment you use in the Army has where it comes from, like the OR, and they had OB-GYN over all those. They had to take a dentist's drill to get it off. So they went down and stole one of those, brought it up, and they worked all night long. Somebody would take it off and the other one would use emery on it to soothe it out. There wasn't a mark. You couldn't tell.
It's interesting, isn't it? Do you have any other stories like that where the creative people, when something was needed,
they always got it.
We call it field expedient.
And
did you use that term?
They used to use unofficial requirement.
Okay.
So I thought, you know, it's up to him. So one of the doctors said to me, where did you get all the placenta, where'd you get all the stump basins? I said, I don't know. Told the sergeant. Like another time at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, that hospital was growing by leaps and bounds, and they couldn't keep up with things. I said to this one patient I had, God, we need blankets, and I don't know where we're going to get them. He said, okay. I didn't think anything more about it. He worked in quartermaster. The next night, we had 40 blankets. So I went over to him, he said, don't say a word. They got him from quartermaster. You know, the fellas could do an American GI can do anything if he wants to.
Sure.
And if you're smart enough to say please and thank you, you can get anything you want. And they'll do it.
Yeah. After Fort Campbell, where did you?
I went to Korea.
Right to Korea?
I went to Japan for a little while.
In a hospital?
Yeah, 279th in Osaka. I was there about 3 months, and then we went to Japan. I mean to Korea.
Korea.
And I got to ride the trains, the hospital trains. We'd pick them up at the MASH units and bring them down sometime to one of the Navy ships. And I loved those Navy ships because they had hot water.
Wow.
And clean clothes.
Were they Navy hospital ships?
Navy hospital ships. We'd pull in there, and I would offload my patients with the nurses and go and look at them, you know, and make sure they were comfortable and everything was safe. And then I'd go to then I'd take a hot shower, and they had gray coveralls the nurses wore. And I always got a clean pair. And I would leave my clothing there and they would take care of it. And then the next time I went down, I'd got my own clothing bag, see?
Was this Army and Navy nurses, or was it?
It was Navy nurses on board.
And they wore the same coveralls? Or?
No.
Oh.
They wore coveralls. We didn't have coveralls.
Oh, okay.
They had gray coveralls. And they were delightful. So that was an interesting job. They would load all the patients that they could possibly load onto the train.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them weren't in very good condition. Now, I didn't like filling out those papers when the patient died on me. That's a lot of work.
Yeah.
So I went around. I had a Navy friend, not a Navy friend, a Marine pilot that was a friend of mine, and he gave me one of their flying jackets.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, are they nice? They got fur around the collar, and they're lined, and they got all these pockets inside.
Mm-hmm.
So I stole everything I could get my hands on. I stole blood, and then there's another, used to be a blood substitute, Inferon, cost $100 a cc, and they came in 10 cc's bottles. I stole them too. I put everything in there I could, you know, in the pockets.
This is from the boat?
Yeah, the only thing, no, from the units, the MASH units. I wouldn't steal from the Navy. So, this one nurse, after I'd been riding the trains about 6 months, she saw me get out and she said, turned around and she said, lock up everything, she's here. But you know, they would tell me where it was.
And you would use it on the trains?
I would use it on the trains, on the fellas. Got a lot of young Marines in. And they were babies. 17, 18-year-old, break your heart. And then I was, one day we were coming down, I had a sergeant on that train that was absolutely talented when he was sober. And all the other nurses kept saying to me, Lib, you're never going to last with him. Because he gets on that train falling down drunk.
Mm-hmm.
So I took him aside one day and I said to him, make a deal with you. He said, what's that? And I said, I'll give you my liquor ration. When you step on this train, you're sober. And when you step off, you're sober. What you do in between is none of my business. But when you put your foot on that train to come up, that is my business. Now I said, you don't want to lose all that pretty stuff you got on your shoulder there. He was a master sergeant. So he said, okay. He was never drunk again on the trains. But I gave him a liquor ration. I didn't care. I could always get a drink in the officers club, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So, but then one day we're coming down, and all suddenly the train stops. So I thought, well, there must be something on the track, which was a usual thing. And he's standing next to me looking out the window, and all of a sudden he said, there goes our fireman and the stoker. And on the hill in the distance, you know these pictures you see of the Chinese on those little ponies with the funny hats?
Oh, yeah.
There's a whole bunch of them up there. And I thought, we're going to die. So I looked at the sergeant and I said to him, say your prayers lately? For some reason or other, I wasn't. So this little corpsman comes up to me. He wasn't, if he was 5 feet tall, that's a lot. He said, I can drive this train. I've been watching him. I said to him, you can? He said, yep. I said, go drive it. So another kid went over with him to be a stoker. We got into Pusan. Now, when the train pulled in Pusan, we pulled into the harbor where they offloaded on ships. Mm-hmm. The kid knew how to start it, but he didn't know how to stop it. We almost went into the drink. But another guy, another American sergeant, ran alongside of the train and jumped on and stopped it.
No, okay.
Just, you know, our wheels were almost off the... That was interesting.
Any other experiences in Korea that you'd like to share with us?
Only one. I worked for a while in a triage area. Mm-hmm. It was just a little bit separated from the rest of the hospital. And they pulled out one night and left us there.
And they left you there by yourselves?
And this young patient says to me, don't worry, Captain. I have a gun. I said, oh, Grace, that's all I needed to know. He said, what do you mean? I said, is your aim good? Because you got to get me with the first one. So all of a sudden there was trucks out in the yard. And it was Marines. They were moving, and they saw us there. And they came and got us.
The Marines did?
Yes. But they loaded patients in... you know what 2.5 is? Truck.
Deuce and a half?
Yeah.
Deuce and a half. Yeah. 2.5 ton truck.
They loaded the patients on there. Some of them were tiered, sort of. But that's the only way we could get out of there.
Yeah, yeah. Now, then did you come back to the United States by boat? How did you get back to the U.S.? Or, do you remember?
I remember. I think I flew.
Flew.
Yeah.
And then, how much longer were you on active duty, or did you stay on active duty?
I stayed on active duty that time.
Korea.
I went to, I didn't see it, my father was dead.
Okay.
I loved my stepmother. But she didn't need me. So I stayed in. I went to Fort Sam to school. I taught at Fort Sam for a while. I taught corpsman at Fort Sam. I went to Denver. I was stationed at the Presidio for a while. And
how did you like that?
I liked it very much.
That's a neat place.
Yeah, it's a nice place. And then I went, I never figured out why. I'm as tactless as they come. I really am. No. I'm blunt, and I say, I always had a high security clearance. And I took care of people like John Foster Dulles and stuff like that. Never could figure out why they did that to me. Because you know, some of the other nurses were polite. I wasn't. You know, this is it. This is what you have to do, and this is what we're going to do.
You said it the way it was.
Yeah. So John Foster Dulles liked to play cards.
He did?
Mm-hmm. At night. And I was the night nurse. So he and I and a couple of his social security security agents would play pinochle at night.
And you were a pretty good pinochle player?
We both were. And see, my father taught us to play cards when we were kids. So he said, one morning when I was going out, the head nurse on the ward, see, some of us were special. You know, we only took care of one patient. So I'm coming out there, and she said, Major Liberty, I want to talk to you. I said, yes, ma'am. She come over and she says to me, he sleeps all day. I want him awake during the daytime. What goes on at night? I said, we play cards. I want that stopped immediately. I said, I would suggest that you talk to him. So he was the gentlest man in the world. And I went back on that night, and he's sitting up in bed, and he says to me, they told me to sleep tonight. And I said, what did you tell them? He said, I'm not telling you, you're a done, but I'm not sleeping. So he said to me, unless they transfer you to days. I said, I can't go to days, I go to school. He said, okay. So he had a son that was a convert to Catholicism.
Mm-hmm.
He also had a sister that was a Presbyterian minister.
Interesting.
She didn't want the son to see his father. So he used to come at night. And he said to me, Dad has a dog that's pining to himself to death.
Mm-hmm.
He said, I don't know what to do. And I said, you wear an overcoat? He said, sure. I said, bring the dog in. He said, well, you can't bring a dog into the hospital. I said, do you think anybody's going to stop you with that collar on? You know, his Roman collar?
Yeah.
He said, I never thought of that. So I used to bring the dog in all the time.
What was John Foster Dulles at this point?
Secretary of State.
He was Secretary of State. Mm-hmm. And he was at what, Walter Reed?
Walter Reed.
Okay.
So I thank God that I was off the night he died.
But you were treating him at that time?
Yes. We had 3 nurses, 3 special nurses. That's all we did, was stay with him. And then another time I was working on open heart recovery up at Walter Reed. Mm-hmm. And they called me to go down to that Ward 8, because I still had my clearance. Yeah. You know, you put your hand on the elevator. And to start at IV on George Marshall. General Marshall.
General Marshall.
General Marshall was a woman hater.
Didn't know that.
He was married and everything. So they couldn't, they didn't know what to do. So I said, he was blind also at the time. So
about how old was he?
Oh, he was old.
In his 80s?
Yeah. So they said, I said, nobody talk to me while I'm in the room. So I went in, started the IV, taped it down, initialed it, and left. About a week later, they called me again, and they said, you're never going to believe this. I said, why? They said, his IV came out, and they were going to call one of the doctors, and they said, they told him, you know, they were going to call somebody, and he said, don't call them. Call the lady that wears the taboo cologne. So I went down, I started it, and he said to me, you're pretty good at that. I said, I have had a lot of experience. I said, it requires experience. Mm-hmm. Most of the doctors don't have that, you know. He said, well, what's your name? So I told him my name, and he said, I'll remember that to call you when I need you.
So, General Marshall.
He was a tough cookie.
I bet. Did you have any other, in that time period in the States, any other people or experiences?
I've had a few, but I can't tell you.
Okay, that's all right. Now, this is...
Because I took care of a lot of diversified patients. And you would be amazed at the type of people that are brought to the Walter Reed and some of our medical centers. You would be amazed. I can tell you one.
Okay, good. Thank you.
You know, Prince Fuad, He had polio as a kid.
I didn't know that.
So they brought him over to Walter Reed to stretch his muscles and see what they could do for him. He's turned out to be a very tall man. His guards, do you realize this polished the bottoms of their shoes?
No.
And the room that he was in was called the pink room. They had pink rugs on the floor, pink brocade on the walls. They'd sit on the couch and where their head rested on the wallpaper, you had a big black spot like that. They were a mess. But when they found out that there was going to be 3 women taking care of him, they almost,
Oh,
that was a no-no. You can't touch their head.
no.
So, and he was only a kid. He was maybe 12, 13 years old. Spoke beautiful English. So, and he was very, very smart. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. He was intelligent. So I went in one day to do something for him, and that guard grabbed my arm, and I said, "You want to lose that?" And he looked at me, and the kid spoke to him in Arabic, and he let me go. And he said to me, "Our customs are women don't touch men's heads." I said, "How do you get pregnant then?" You know. I said, "This is weird. You people have harems." They think we're decadent. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But he was a nice patient. I was very proud when he walked out of there. And he walked straight.
So then now you're still on active duty, and
then I went to I went to Hawaii.
Hawaii.
I was stationed there for 2 years.
Tripler.
Tripler. Uh-huh. On Oahu.
Oh, okay.
They call it it's pink sandstone, and when you fly over it, when you're coming in, the pilot will say, "Look at the Pink Palace." It's up on a little hill, and that's where I saw volcanoes. I had a friend in the Navy, and whenever one was getting ready to erupt or was erupting, and I wasn't on duty, he'd pick me up, and he had a little plane, and we'd fly over it. You can't believe the beauty and the colors. There's colors that you don't see, that we never see, like heliotrope and all that. In that fire and in the sky, it's beautiful. I know it's a destructive thing, but it's so beautiful.
So you were at Tripler Army Hospital?
Uh-huh, yeah.
For
14 months, 24 months.
24 months.
Uh-huh. I had a little house in Pearl City.
Oh.
And I had a banana tree, a papaya grove, and coffee. And the gentleman in back of me, who was a Japanese man, and orchids growing up the fence.
Wow.
And orchids, poinsettias. Poinsettias are not little plants. They'll grow to the top of the roof. So he took care of all that stuff for me. He would hang the bananas in the washroom. Oh, and I had an outside tub. I had a tub inside, but an outside tub too. And a washer and a dryer outside. And it was the nicest thing to be able to hang up your clothes on the line, but you had to be very careful. You had to know when Dow was going to burn the pineapple fields.
Oh yes, oh yes. Now this is maybe about the time. Where were you during the Cuban Missile Crisis? Do you remember?
Yes, I was in Florida.
On active duty?
Yep.
In Florida? Can you remember something about that?
We lived in a motel. They took over a whole motel for this hospital. We didn't go. We were ready. Mm-hmm. And They had the girls living on the top floor and the men living on the second floor, which is a weird. And we were there about 3 weeks before they sent us back to our our stations.
But there was a tense
We were ready
time.
to go. Yeah, we were ready. We couldn't leave the area at all. We couldn't go out to eat or anything. We had to stay right there. And we had to be dressed at all times.
And where were you when President Kennedy was assassinated?
Germany.
You were in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And what was the reaction there?
Horror. Horror. Another thing funny, I was stationed in Heidelberg. And I used to walk to work from where we lived because it wasn't very far, and it was a nice walk. So I got onto the base this one morning, and I looked up, and the flag was upside down. And I thought, I wonder what that's all about. There's got to be a reason. So I went into work, and I worked on recovery and accident ward. So our commanding officer was Colonel St. John. He comes in, he said to me, Liv, do you have any idea who surrendered my fort? I said to him, what do you mean? He said, when the flag's upside down, you're surrendering. I said, why would you ask me? I didn't do it. He said, somebody did it. The sergeant of the guard who put the flag up was drunk.
Oh, no.
So another sergeant was out there getting it down, you know, and the old man went out again, you know. And he said to me, didn't you notice it when you came in? I said, yes. Well, what did you want me to do? And I didn't know what it was.
Interesting. After Germany, where did you go?
Oh, Fort Monmouth, New Jersey.
Fort Monmouth, okay.
And I was chief nurse there. And then I went to Vietnam.
Okay, when were you in Vietnam? Do you remember the year? Or you were there a couple of times, weren't you?
I was there 3 times.
3 times. And how about some of your...
First time I went there, I was one of the people that was instrumental in starting the MASH units. You know, the special equipment. That is a unit that's supposed to fit entirely on a plane, on a pallet. And it comes up all by itself. It even has the oxygen in the walls. It's a beautiful thing. And the beds fit into the walls. What you see on television. That's not a MASH unit. But they weren't using them right, and they weren't operating correctly. They were having trouble with the OR and all that stuff. So some of us would go over, there'd be a doctor, who's usually a colonel, and then there would be 4 or 5 nurses and about 5 corpsmen. And we'd go over, and we'd be there about a month. And we'd get it all straightened out, and we'd go back. Then the second time I went over, I was a kind of a disciplinarian. And they were having trouble with a couple of the head nurses or chief nurses in some of the MASH units.
Are you still a major at this time? Or
No, I was a colonel.
Lieutenant Colonel, okay.
So I had to go find out what it was. They were getting letters. The chief nurse was getting letters from these younger nurses complaining. And then there was one colonel in charge of the hospital, one hospital, that was complaining. So I went over, you know, and that was my least favorite job.
Oh, everything you did in the Army,
that was the least
assignment, yeah.
So I went in and I reported into the commanding officer. They signed me a tent, a bunk. And I cleaned up a little bit, and I went over to the office to see her. She was an old friend. We'd been friends for years. And this was about maybe 11 o'clock in the morning. So I started talking to her and asking her what was wrong and all this stuff. And I knew she didn't act right, you know. So I thought, I wonder if she's had a stroke, you know, a cerebral accident or something. She didn't act right. So she said to me, sit down, Lib, take a load off and we'll have a drink. She pulled out her bottom desk drawer, pulled out a jug and 2 glasses. I said to her, it's not even noon yet. Doesn't make any difference. I said, put that thing back and go pack. What do you mean? I said, you're no longer here. Who's your assistant? So she, you know, got indignant. She didn't have a stroke, she was drunk. In the morning. So I said to her, you know how I feel about this. You of all people. Because I wouldn't even allow a nurse to work in the OR who smelled of it from the night before. That's got to be the worst thing in the world, to wake up to have somebody breathing on you. So she said, and don't get me wrong, I drank. So she said, you can't do this to me. And I said, oh, yes, I can. I said, I got your orders right here. All I got to do is sign them. So
that had to be unpleasant. A tough thing.
Very unpleasant, very unpleasant. And that's, you know, when you think back on it, that's a lot of power to give to a woman. A lot of power. You could wreck somebody. But, you know, I asked them why, and they said to me, because you're straight arrow.
That was a phrase the Vietnamese used. Straight arrow meant you were honest. And that's the first time I had heard it. And did you ever hear this in Vietnam? Number 1 GI?
Yeah.
And number 10, could you tell us what that meant?
Number 1 GI was the big boss, and number 10 was no good.
I haven't heard that since I was there.
So then the next time I went over, I was stationed in Saigon for a while. And then they sent me to Cam Ranh Bay. And that was a large hospital. And patients were all recovering from injuries, you know. And it also had the main blood bank of all of Vietnam. It was a concrete brick building, which you don't see over there. But everything was underground. And the guy that was in charge of that used to serve tea every once in a while. A drop of tea and a little hooch in a china cup. This was Southern hospitality. So then we went to, I was stationed there, and then they hit us, you know, from the, sappers hit us from the water. They burnt, they knew what they were after. Exactly what they were after. The top NCO billets. Now, you know, when you lose your, it's like a snake, when you lose your top NCOs, that's like cutting off the head of the snake. The male nurses, POQ, and the doctors. The commanding officer, and me. I woke up with the back end of my, you know, in a trailer, you know how they have those big windows in the back? Yeah. Well, I woke up and it was light. And you wore most of your clothes because you used to have to, they, you know, send stuff over every once in a while. So you had to get out, and I had to get out all those young kids and make sure they were in a bunker and, you know, hot, hysterical and all that jazz. So I thought, oh my God, I overslept. Because I thought it was the sun. So you slept with most of your clothes on. You kept your boots upside down so you wouldn't have bugs crawling in there, you know, lizards and stuff. So I put my boots on, stepped out, stepped over a little box in the hallway by the back door, which I never used. And the guard, the sentry hollered, "Colonel, get down." And I said to him, "What's going on?" He said, "Colonel, get down." And I didn't move fast enough, and he tackled me. And I went down in the sand, my face in the sand. And I said to him, "You better have a damn good reason for this." He said, "We're under attack." He said, "That bright light you're seeing is the barracks going up."
Oh, no. Was this Tet?
No.
No.
So he said, it was right after Johnson made the speech that Cam Ranh Bay was the safest place in the world.
Oh.
We didn't have any arms, nothing. We didn't even have sentries out, except the nurses' quarters, the nurses' area. So I said to him, "Well, I better get down to the emergency room." I crawled in a ditch with I hate bugs. Cockroaches that are this big, and down to the emergency room, and this kid covered me with his body. And we're crawling along, and he said, "Oh, Colonel, if anything happens to you, they're going to kill me." I said to him, "If it happens to me, you're going to be dead." But the Air Force that was over on Main Station in Cam Ranh Bay, they rescued us.
They did.
Navy ships were coming in from their night patrols,
Yeah.
and they offloaded instead of offloading their ammunition in the water, they offloaded it over us when they saw the fires. They called in to ask if they could help, and you know what they were told? They had to get permission from the village chief.
Really?
So they offloaded anyway. You know, they didn't hear that. And but the Navy, I mean the Army and the Air Force and the Navy came over and rescued us. They had Air Force nurses that came over and helped us, and some of the doctors, and they killed. This made me so mad. They killed 85 men that were already wounded.
That were hospitalized.
But you know, this is something funny about Vietnam.
Good.
We had a couple of corpsmen who were from the Okefenokee swamps.
Mm-hmm.
They were snake catchers. That's how they made their living in civilian life. There was a lot of snakes in Vietnam.
Yes.
And they used to catch the snakes for the vet.
Mm-hmm.
But once in a while they'd catch them and have some fun. They took 2 snakes and they laid them over where the colonel, the commanding officer, walked up the path to get into his office. They had 2 snakes laying across there. The colonel was a little man, little short guy. You never saw anything so funny in your life as him dancing up and down and screaming. So I caught the 2 of them. They were on duty. And I said, you go over there and remove those snakes. They said, "Do we gotta?" I said, "Yes." And they said, "We were only having fun." I said, "That's not funny. Those snakes were as long as this room." So they picked them up, put them in their sacks, and took them over to the vet. And then one night we heard all this commotion, and there was a water tank. Oh, maybe 50 yards from where the nurses' billets were. And there was always a sentry. After we got attacked, there was always a sentry up there. He was hollering for help. There was a snake crawling up the side of the thing. And honest to God, its head was this big. And
He was thirsty?
the sergeant, the colonel, the sergeant, the night sergeant, was standing down at the bottom of the tower saying to the kid, "Shoot him, shoot him." The kid saying, "I ain't getting that close." So they had to call these kids out to get them. They had to crawl up the side of the water tower. They said, "Oh, that was a good one."
Question. You experienced treating soldiers in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. What were some of the significant changes in the way, combination of techniques and technology between World War II and
Vietnam was more advanced.
Much more advanced?
Oh, yes. And we got them right off the field. They still had their ammo on them when we got them, most of the times, especially in Saigon. We got them off from the Delta. They were covered with mud and slime. And we used to take a hose, a water hose, and wipe them off, you know, clean them off, because you couldn't get near them. There was so much mud on them.
Yeah.
And one of the high-ranking officers from Washington was there one day. And she said, "Oh my, do you have to use a hose?" So I was working in the triage center. I used to go, I couldn't stand that office. I used to go and work, you know. And I said to her, "Well, what would you suggest, Colonel?" "Oh, there must be something." I said, "Well, you go back to Washington and sit behind your nice little desk and you dream of something and then notify us and we'll do it." She said, "You're being sarcastic." I said, "Yes, I am." I said, "No, don't get too close because you might get dirty."
But
So,
it was, things were really much improved.
much improved, much improved. The hardest thing for the Americans were to learn was triage. Not to learn it, to practice it. Now, in our culture, you take care of the worst first. You don't do that. You take care of the walking wounded, and the one that'll only require one doctor to take care of him in surgery. And they get, that way they can get 20 or 30 done. And you leave the others beside, off, you know, and you bolster them with fluid and pain medication. And then when the doctors get finished, they take them, because sometimes it'll take 2 or 3 to operate on one patient. And I had one kid, and I used to try to get the nurses, the boys that were that badly hurt, I would try to get the, I did something terrible. I used to get the kids that were pretty and made them use cologne and stuff and go in there and sit with them. Because I figured, at least let them, if they're going to die, let them see an American woman that smells good, you know? So, and I used to go relieve them. So I went in one day and this little nurse says to me, "Oh, I gotta go to the bathroom, Colonel. I gotta go terrible." I said, "Go to the bathroom, sit down, take your time, have something to eat, and walk around a little bit." And I said, "I'll be here," because I had some paperwork to do. So I'm saying my rosary beads a lot. I used to carry them in my pocket. So I'm saying my rosary beads and sitting there, and this fellow says to me, "What's that noise?" When you're dying or when you're that close to death, your hearing is more acute. I said to him, "I'm saying my rosary beads." He said, "You don't read, do you?" I said, "Oh, I read very well, thank you." He said, "I'm Jewish." I said, "You believe in God?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Same guy." So we sat there for a while, and he was really abrupt. Well, he was dying, you know. So pretty soon, the OR came in, and they said, "We're going to take him, Lib." I said, "Okay." So as I was getting up to leave, he said to me, "Let me have those beads. They may be lucky." I said, "Oh, they're more than luck." So I gave him the beads. And I chalked it up to another pair of rosary beads lost, because I lost a lot of them that way. So the next day I'm in the hall, and one of the nurses came along to me, and she said to me, "You know that last guy we took?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "He did better than the others. He's already gone to Japan." I said, "Isn't that marvelous?" I went from from Vietnam to Fort Belvoir, which is a little Walter Reed. You got all the senators' wives and...
Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah, politicians.
Yeah, I knew Betty Ford was a drunk before anybody else did.
You did?
Yeah, I had her as a patient.
At Belvoir?
Uh-huh. So,
so you're saying you went there after Vietnam?
this fella, I was there about maybe a couple of months, and I got a package. I don't know how this guy found me, but it was a pair of rosary beads. And it said, "I'm keeping the others." So I'm home and retired now. This happened maybe 10 years ago. I get a phone call. I don't know how this guy finds me. He's in New York. He's the vice president of a bank. He said, "I just want you to know that in an ashtray on my desk is your rosary beads." And he said, "Nobody can figure that out." And he said, "And another thing, I just had a granddaughter born in Israel." And he said, "She's Liberty Ann." I said, "How could you do that to a kid?" He said, "I always talked about you and my son wanted her name that." I cried.
What a powerful, wonderful story.
I had a good life. I had a good life. I had good education. I had good experiences.
Did you, when you were in these combat zones, did you ever get any medals? Did you, if you want, you don't have to tell us, but
Yes.
you did. Okay.
I was also offered the Purple Heart.
You were.
I refused it.
You were wounded once?
Yes. Shrapnel from Vietnam.
And you refused it?
Yes. If I'd have kept my head down like the kid told me, I wouldn't have been hit. I had a male nurse in Saigon wanted the Purple Heart. He was up on top of the building during a firefight smoking a cigarette. He put in for it and I tore it up. He didn't deserve it. Anybody that go up there, he was a target, for God's sakes. And besides that, I firmly believe that the Purple Heart was meant for people in combat that were really wounded.
Okay, after Fort Belvoir, or how about any
I
stories?
retired at Fort Belvoir.
Okay, any other stories about your experiences at Fort Belvoir?
Can't tell those.
Okay, all right. And you retired at Fort Belvoir and you come back to New York State?
I went around and tried to volunteer, and they wouldn't let me. They said I was too qualified. I went to all the hospitals and tried to volunteer. All I wanted to do was make beds, feed patients, and give baths and stuff like that. They wouldn't let me. And I wanted to do it for free. So then the nun at St. Peter's called me and asked me to come in. She said, "I think I have a solution to your problem." So I went in. She sits there at this desk and she looks at me. Now she's out of this.
Go ahead. Yeah, okay.
We was in a chopper with 6 young nurses and the chief nurse of the army, the general.
This is in Vietnam.
And we got hit. The rear gunner got hit and the co-pilot. But we didn't crash. We sat down.
This was a Huey?
In the jungle. Yeah. So I'm looking around and I'm thinking, oh God. And the kids were screaming and hollering and yelling. Well, I finally got them under control. And I knew the general personally, and I said to her, "Pat, are you all right?" And she said, "Yeah." She said, "You're your usual self." So I said, "Well, we got to get out of here." I said, "We're going to have to walk out." Now, I said, the co-pilot has got an arm injury. I've already given him first aid. And I said, it's in a sling. And I said, but the other kid's got to be carried out. We did have litters. So we got outside, we got the kid on the litter, and the 6 nurses are looking around and looking at me. I said, you're going to take turns carrying that. This one girl looks at me and she said, I didn't come in the army to carry litters. I'm a nurse.
And
I said, you are either going to carry that or you're going to share it with them. So they got on it. I happened to look over into the jungle, and there was a lizard. It looked as big as a dragon to me. Mm-hmm. And I said to the pilot, who was walking alongside of me, is that thing, I said, look at that thing. He said, Liv, don't be afraid, they're herbivorous. I said, does he know that? And the co-pilot was Point. And we were coming up the back, and he says to me, the pilot says to me, you want a gun, Lib? And I said, what would I do with it? I said, I'm afraid of them. So we walked along, well, we heard a noise, and we got into the ditch, and I thought, oh my God, I can't let these young nurses be taken prisoner. It was a Marine patrol that saw it go down, the chopper go down, and came looking for us.
Okay.
Would you believe that? I never was so glad to see them, but they were delighted to see those young nurses.
Do you remember what they called American women over there? We had a term for it. I don't know if you ever.
No, I never heard
Round
it.
eyes.
Round eyes. Oh yeah. Mm.
Because, and it was a treat to see American nurses or American women over there. Absolutely. How did you keep in touch with your family during all these wars?
Oh, by letter, but you know, in Vietnam, when Cameron Bay got hit, my family knew where I was.
Oh, yeah.
And ham operators.
Was it Mars Radio? Was that it?
Yes. Yeah. And they got me through to speak to one of my sisters. Mm-hmm. And she was screaming and hollering and crying and carrying on. And I said to her, if you shut up for a minute, I'll tell you I'm all right. She said, I've had the Red Cross and everybody else. And she ran to the church, she ran all over. You know, she said, all we want to know is how she is, if she's all right. But I have a younger brother, or had a younger brother. He was a master sergeant. He was command sergeant major in Fort Sill, Oklahoma when he died.
Really?
And one of the times when I was in Saigon going for about the MASH units, mm-hmm. and we were sitting on the balcony of an officer's hotel, and I happened to look down in the street and I said, hey, look at that little short guy coming up. The bow-legged one? Looks like my brother. So this other nurse that knew him looked down, she said, hey, it is, Lib. So we went down in the street to see him. And he'd give me a kiss and a hug, you know. And his lieutenant says to him, hey, Sarge, take it easy. He said, this is my sister. With that, their commanding officer came along. They were going someplace to put in some gun emplacements. Mm-hmm. The commanding officer says, she'll have to leave. Can't have two of you in country. So the guy that's the head of our group is standing back of me, and he said, oh no, he's got to leave. She comes first. That little snot went to Bangkok.
Your brother.
And had a good time. And I don't know how he kept finding me, but every once in a while he'd find me and he'd say, how you doing, kid? And I'd say, they're shooting at me, for God's sakes. And he'd say, lovely here. But I would have gone I wouldn't have let him stay for me.
You mentioned, okay, did you ever send tapes back and forth, audio tapes?
No. No.
Letters, and in Vietnam, yeah. Mars Radio.
Yeah.
But letters in
Korea and World War II, yeah.
Okay. Did you ever save any of those letters, or did any relatives save them for things?
I don't think so, no.
Now, I don't know if you would do anything like this, Liv, but did you ever hear of somebody that pulled a prank when they were in the Army? Anything having to do with fountains or anything like that? No? You don't have to tell the story.
I was stationed at Walter Reed, and in the old building, and in the front of it was a big fountain.
Oh.
And we had a particularly bad week. at Walter Reed in the recovery room and all that stuff. And so a bunch of us had been over at the Officers Club, and we'd had a few. And we were on our way home. And we walked by the fountain, and somebody said, I wonder how that would look with bubbles in it. So we went over to the nurses' quarters, and we got our bubble bath, and we came over back, and we put it in the fountain. Now the moon was out, beautiful sight, all those bubbles all over. And then we realized what we had done, and we ran like hell. So the next morning, I'm in the recovery room, and in those days when you did open heart surgery, you gave them back exactly how much blood they lost through the tubes. And you had to get, they didn't have, you know, this was new. You had to get down on the floor and put your head on the floor to measure the drainage. So I was down there measuring drainage, and there was a pair of shoes come along beside me, and it was General Heaton, Surgeon General of the Army. And he said, Lib, something terrible's happening. I thought, oh my God, what? So I backed out and I said to him, what? He said, somebody put soap in the fountain in front of the hospital and killed my goldfish. I said to him, I think that's terrible. Who could do such a cruel thing like that? He said, that's what I thought. So a little while later, one of the doctors comes over and he said to me, thank God I had a mask on. I said, why? He said, because he says to me, do you know somebody killed my goldfish? He said, Lib, I almost laughed out loud. I said to him, well, we got away with that. But I was always, one of the nurses on the ward said to me, you did that, didn't you? I said, no. She said, that's something you would do. That was fun.
Yeah. Any stories about either the way the troops or your nurses entertained themselves, or the way they were entertained by USO shows or anything like that?
You know what we used to do to the movies, especially in Korea? We'd turn the sound off.
Yeah.
And take the parts of the movie. We had it so many times.
Oh.
Or either that, or we'd run it backwards. That's very interesting.
How about, now, do you remember the day that you were discharged, that you left active duty? Remember
Yes.
Anything special you want to say about that day?
Well, I was the only female retiring that day or getting out. And I was the ranking officer, so I had to lead off the parade. And I thought, oh my God, what if I forget to step off right, you know? Mm-hmm. And medical people aren't good at saluting. My youngest brother, when I was ever on a base, like giving a lecture or anything like that, and he was there, he'd run out the front door and wait for me to come out to make me salute him so he could laugh at me. And boy, you're bringing back a lot of memories. But we weren't good at saluting the medical people.
I know.
We didn't know how. Anyway, when I was retiring, I had to step up to the general, salute him, and he pinned a medal on me and all that stuff. And I led the line, see? Mm-hmm. And my sister, two of my sisters were there, and a very good friend. And I got up, apparently I did it all right, because nobody laughed. And after it was over with, this one sergeant walks over to me and he said, Colonel, you made me proud.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And then?
Then we had a party.
Uh-huh.
And one of the generals was there. And he was talking to one of my sisters. And of course, she didn't understand a word he was saying. So she says to him, I think your wife is looking for you. And Annie Houlihan was a a major in the Army at that time says to me, "My God, Lib, Shirley dismissed the general."
That's funny. That's funny. Did you ever join any veterans organizations after the Army? Any experiences with that?
Yes, I joined the American Legion.
American Legion.
And then my brothers were both members of the VFW and Water Elite, and I wanted to join there. He told me to join the auxiliary.
Which is the women's side of it.
So I told them that I had more time overseas than most of them had the pay that most of them had in the chow line, and you ate 3 times a day. And I walked out of there. I was so mad, and I would have punched that guy if I'd have dared. So I went home, and then I gave an interview at one time or other, and I mentioned that to somebody. And the very next day, I was offered to join just about every VFW post in the. And I said, no, I don't want to join that one. I want to join the one in Water Elite, and I won't do it now. But then a fellow that was used to be a boyfriend of one of my younger sister, and grew up around us, you know. And when he would come over to take Dot out, we'd make him take the ashes out and dry the dishes and take the garbage out. And he came over and he said, come over to visit me. He said to me, please, do it for me. So I joined the VFW at Water Elite. Can you imagine the nerve of him telling me to join the auxiliary? I said a lot of swear words too.
How about TROA? Did you join?
Yes, I belong to that, yeah. Mm-hmm. They're changing that name,
Yeah,
isn't they?
it must have passed.
Yeah.
I haven't heard officially. To Military Officers Association.
Yeah.
The Retired
Officers Association, yeah.
And they're going to be changing it to the Military
Military Officers Association. I gave a talk one time there.
Yeah, that's where I met you at that a couple of years ago at that meeting. Along those lines, what have you done in terms of speaking? Who have you spoken to about your experiences since you retired?
I spoke there. I've spoken a lot of places.
Schools?
Schools, yeah.
But,
I don't know how I ever got started. Somebody got me, and I can't remember who it was.
But you've spoken many times.
Yeah, and I gave when they made the Women's Memorial in Albany.
Oh, in Albany.
Yeah, I gave the dedication speech.
And also, tell us your involvement in it's relatively new World War II memorial in Albany.
Yeah, I was at, there was 1, 2, 3, 3 women and a bunch of gentlemen. And the design was all ready. Just needed approval. And the gentleman that made that, the architect that made that is very talented. And then we had something to do with the sayings that are on it. You know, like Eisenhower, Patton, and MacArthur. Something that they said.
There were quotes from each.
Yeah, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Have you kept in touch with some of the people that you served with?
Yes.
Any stories about that relationship?
We're dying off.
They are?
Because I'm 79. And I was one of the younger ones.
Yeah. But you had a lot of people that you met in the military and that you stayed in touch with for years and years.
Now, when I got ready to retire, like most nurses that were footloose and fancy free, I wanted to go to Florida. So I went down there, and a lot of them were living in this little cul-de-sac. And I stayed with one of them, and there was a house for sale, and it was cute, and I had looked at it. Then all of a sudden I realized I was the one that doing all the toting. You know, Lib pick this up, Lib pick that up, Lib put this in here, Lib do that, and I thought, hell, I'll be a busboy for these people. I went home. And I'm not sad. I'm very glad that I did. Because the first 20 years I traveled a great deal.
First 20 years of retirement.
Mm-hmm. Then I had a heart attack.
Oh. In those 20 years, did you ever unexpectedly run across somebody that you had served with?
Oh, yes.
Tell us about one or two of those, or a favorite story.
I was at in Wilden, New Jersey. A friend of mine had a house there that she had owned for many years. She and her husband were living there. And I used to go and stay with them periodically. They had converted their barn, their garage, into a guest house. Mm-hmm. And she and I was walking on the beach one day. This man and woman went to pass me, and he stopped and he looked and he said, "Lib?" And I said, "George, how are you?" Well, his wife grew 9 feet tall. He put his arms around me, give me a big kiss, you know, and all that stuff. And he says to her, "Honey, this is Frances Liberty. I've told you a lot about her." He said, "She's the one that picked out that brocade for you in Tokyo." He could have swallowed his tongue. And I said, she said to me, "Oh, you have good taste." I said, "Oh, yes." And then...
what was that, Vietnam or...
Korea.
Korea, that was Korea.
And then I met a sergeant's wife one time. I don't know where I was, but I can see her. And she heard somebody, I was in the PX someplace, and she heard somebody call me by name. So she came over and she said to me, "Are you a lieutenant colonel?" And I said, "No, I was, but I'm not now." She said, "Did you know a sergeant by the name of Hennessy?" I said, "Oh, yeah." She said, "I wish he were here, because he loves you." I said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I rode him to death." She said, "You made him go to school." She said, "You know that he's going to take his bar exams next month? He's a lawyer." I said, "Isn't that marvelous?" She said, "He wouldn't have done it if you hadn't driven him. I used to say to him, 'You're too damn smart for this.' You know, that made me..." And then in Vietnam, when I was in Italy, I was the godmother to one of the first American babies born over there, a boy. When I was in Vietnam, I come out of the office and we were very busy, and this young pilot walked up to me. And he says to me, "I'm looking for the chief nurse." I said, "Why?" I was very wary. He said, looked down at my uniform and he said, "I'm looking for you." I said, "You are?" He said, "Do you remember in Rome, Italy, being a godmother to a kid by the name of Robert Bees?" I said, his father was a Air Force colonel." He said, "That's me." Now that's weird.
That is. What a story. Wow. Did you ever go to any reunions?
Yes, a lot of them.
Tell us a good story about a reunion.
Well, there really isn't any good stories about there. A lot of crying.
Yeah? Really?
Yeah. drinking too, but
Yeah.
you know, when you get to talking, you remember all sorts of things, and somebody's dead, and I didn't go to the last one. I couldn't make it.
What was, looking back on your military, this can be one story, can be two. What was the most joyful experience that you had, or the happiest, or the most satisfying? And that can be, that can be all wrapped up into one or two, but do you have something that, when I say those things, that you think about?
At Fort Dix, New Jersey. Fort Dix, New Jersey is right next door to McGuire Air Base.
Right.
It's a Sunday morning, and we had this young pilot crash out in the field. He could have landed that plane, but it would have been in a housing area. And it was a Sunday morning, and he would have killed a lot of kids. So he chose to land, to crash over in the field. The plane was on fire. He was burned, maybe 60% of his body. And right around his neck, you know when they wore the silk scarf?
Yeah.
There was a band there. Burned. And he lost an ear. They said he didn't have a chance. They wouldn't even transfer him to Fort Sam, to the burn unit, because he was too far gone. We took care of him. Nurses took their days off to special him, and their time off duty to special him. He did not die. We got him strong enough and well enough so he went to Fort Sam Houston and had all his skin graft done and everything else. I went to Fort Sam Houston to take a class on something, maybe 5 years later. And we went into the officers club at Kelly Field, you know, that's the air base. And we were sitting there at the bar having a drink, and this fella sat down next to me. And I happened to look over at his glass, and it's got an ear in it. I thought, what's that? So I looked at him, and I looked at him for a minute, and he said, you don't remember, do you? I said, well, you're much handsomer than you used to be. It was him. That is one of the most satisfying things I've ever known.
Wonderful. Wonderful. If you had something to share with the people that are going to be looking at you years from now about your experiences, your life in the military, nursing in general, what would your words be?
It's the most satisfying career you can have. It is the most promising career you can have. It offers you untold benefits that you won't realize until you actually try it. And I think every nurse should take a stab at it for 3 years. You will use the best equipment in the world. You will work with some of the smartest, dedicated, most men in the world, along with the women. In Vietnam, when you had triage, you didn't have to ring the bell. They heard the choppers come in and they were there. The doctors. You meet the most fascinating people. And the educational choices are unlimited if you want to do it. But you have to want to do it. Mm-hmm. Just like in everything else. It's a very satisfying career. I wouldn't change it for the world.
Francis Liberty, Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Army, retired. Thank you very much.
You're welcome, Jake. You're welcome, Tom.